Hello, everyone, and a very warm virtual welcome to all of you, to our alumni, to our friends, to everyone tuning in today to this afternoon session. My name is Shannon Rose Peterson, and I'm the Director of Alumni Initiatives here at the University of Oregon Alumni Association. Thank you so much for joining us for our latest faculty lecture, Achieving Goals: The Science Behind Self-Control with Professor Elliot Berkman. Before we dive into the topic, I just want to extend a huge thank you to all of our UOAA members. Your support makes events like this possible, and all of us at the Alumni Association are truly grateful for your commitment to our community. I'd also like to thank everyone who submitted questions in advance for this event. I have all of your 85 questions here, and we'll address as many of them as we can at the end of this presentation. If you have any additional questions that come up during the presentation, please submit them using the Q&A feature below. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Elliot Berkman. Elliot is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, co-director of the Center for Translational Neuroscience, faculty in the Balmer Institute for Children's Behavioral Health, and a divisional associate dean for the natural sciences. His work adopts a translational neuroscience approach by using knowledge of brain function, structure, and connectivity to design and improve interventions on health, behavior, and well-being. And I set the goal to not ramble on too much at the beginning of this webinar. So with that, I will stop talking and hand it over to Elliot. Elliot, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Shannon. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining, and thank you for sending your comments and questions ahead. I've tried to address them, some of them in the presentation, and of course, we'll have time for Q&A. So I will talk a little bit about the science of self-control. First, I want to tell you a bit about why self-control is interesting to me. I think it's fascinating because it's central to so many common struggles in everyday life, right? Things ranging from sort of neural disorders like ADHD, more kind of everyday, kind of quotidian issues that we all face, like doom scrolling these days, behavioral change, like dieting or quitting smoking, being more physically active. It plays a big role in our professional context and in the workplace, right? Self-control is really important to staying on task, even sometimes when, the task is boring and you have other things going on. And then all the way to sort of larger societal issues such as addiction. Self-control is central to all these things. And sort of zooming out a little bit, one of the kind of philosophical things that makes me really interested in self-control as a topic of scientific study is this kind of paradox, which is that self-control, you could argue, is a uniquely human thing, or at least goal pursuit is a kind of human propensity. But at the same time, despite being kind of one of the characteristics of the human experience, we can easily come up with lots of examples where we've failed in our self-control. And in fact, I think kind of as a species, we're pretty bad at it. And that's fascinating to me because, think about unique features that other organisms have, unique adaptations that other animals might have. And usually it's something that makes them really good, right? Cheetahs or leopards are really fast, right? That's something that they have that's really special. We have this capacity for self-control, but we can't run as fast as cheetahs can, right, in terms of how well we exercise our self-control. Today, we'll talk about three big topics. One is just this kind of fundamental issue of what even is self-control. When we use the term, what do we mean? And we'll look at a definition there, think it through, and then think about the implications of what self-control really is. I'll tell you a little bit about why self-control fails. This is a big topic. Of course, this is the question a lot of people want to know the answer to when they're new to this topic. It's something like, great, all that philosophical stuff, blah, blah, blah. But like, why do I fail and how can I get better at it? And then I'll run through a handful of examples, partly in response to the questions that you asked before, that kind of where I'll talk about how self-control plays out in different contexts in our daily lives, and different ways that psychologists and others, psychologists, neuroscientists, have thought about how we could try to be better at self-control in those contexts. So let's turn to that first question. What is it? It's actually a tricky thing to define. I mean, it's a little bit one of these like, well, I know it when I see it, but it's hard to define. And it's in particular, it's hard to separate out from other related ideas in psychology or in kind of, everyday language, like self-regulation. Willpower is a big one. What does it mean to have good willpower? Is that the same thing as self-control? Conscientiousness, a personality trait that is pretty linked to self-control. And then even, is it a state or a trait, right? Is it something you engage in one time, or, one thing at a time, right? Or is it something that is a trait about kind of you that is consistent across time? Um, and so we can look at both of those. Psychologists have studied these questions, right? When I engage in self-control, is that just it? Is self-control just like a particular behavior I just, do once and then, maybe I'll do it again later, but there's no kind of connection between those two things? Or is it really something that's kind of consistent? Is it more like the strength of a muscle that you have where, if you're good at it at one time point, you're probably good at it at another time point? So a typical textbook definition, I should know. I'm an author of a psychology textbook. This is the kind of thing that we put in. It would say something like, well, self-control is the process of inhibiting, avoiding, or preventing, right? So those are the verbs there, right? Inhibit, avoid, prevent. Thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that interfere with a goal. So one central thing about this definition is that it really kind of rests on the idea that we have a goal, right? There's some ultimate, target that we're striving for, and that there are things that get in the way. And those things can be tempting behaviors, right? So like if my goal is to diet or to change my eating, I might be tempted by some kind of junk food, right? These are kind of canonical examples of self-control. Or if my goal is to quit smoking, I might be tempted by, someone offering me a cigarette, that kind of thing. So those would be examples of behaviors, but they're not just behaviors, right? It could be thoughts, it could be feelings, just anything at all that gets in the way of a goal. How well do we deal with that, right? How well do we deal with that temptation? So thinking through this definition, one thing that strikes me and researchers in the field is there are many ways, right? There are many ways to be successful at this, to inhibit, avoid, prevent thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that interfere with a goal, right? So right away, I think that's one key lesson from today. It's just that it's not, self-control is not one thing. It's kind of an outcome, right? It's sort of like being successful at this process, but there's many different ways to do that. People can vary over their lifespan, right? There's no guarantee that how successful you are in self-control right now or how successful you've been in the past is determinative of how you'll do in the future. As you'll see, there is some continuity. There is some kind of trait-like aspect. There tends to be consistency across time, but it's not destiny, right? And of course, the other implication of that is that people can differ from each other, right? So to some extent, there are people that are better or worse at this capacity. And we'll turn next to how you might change that. So I mentioned that kind of right off the bat, one of the first things that follows from our definition of self-control is that there's many ways to engage it, many ways to be self-directed. And so my colleague Angela Duckworth and Katie Duckworth is at Penn, Katie Milkman's at USC. These are some colleagues in the field. They tried to actually sort of map out all the different kinds of interventions and all the different sort of tricks and tips and tools that the field has identified to help people to help improve their self-control. In this particular case, what they did is they kind of mapped out this space, literally, right, along an X and Y axis. They look at it from, some of these strategies are more along this sort of horizontal axis here, cognitive, so like mental things that we do, like the way you think about the problem is certainly one feature of self-control. To on the left side, thinking about situational ways of engaging self-control. So situational things being like the actual environment around you, right? It's if I'm tempted to eat certain kinds of foods, one way I could do that is by not having those foods physically present, right? If it's like just literally not an option to do something, right? That would be a kind of a situational strategy. A cognitive strategy would be more like, no, the food I'm trying not to eat is still there, but I just need to sort of change the way I think about it so that it's less tempting. And then along the vertical axis here is sort of self-employed versus other employed. So, you know, that's kind of self-evident. It's like, is this a strategy that you do yourself, right? So goal setting is a good example, right? You can set your own goals. You can determine them, abandon them, all you want, versus other deployed. So these are things like kind of commitment strategies where you bind yourself to a certain behavior, and then that can be enforced by other people. And so a good example of that would be, well, one strategy they list there is hard paternalism. So like the government or your employer or somebody actually eliminates something as an option. A good example of that in our society these days is, well, it used to be something like gambling, right? There's laws, really hard restrictions around gambling. Again, there was up until fairly recently, right? And that was one way for essentially other people to exert self-control on our behalf. We'll come back to these, but I just wanted to highlight the idea that there's this kind of broad variety of strategies that can help us be successful at self-control. Let me zoom in on one particular one that has to do with, you could say more kind of cognitive, right? And it really has to do with how much people differ in the ways they think about their goals and about self-control challenges. This is work that I did here in the UO psychology department with my colleagues, Rita Ludwig, who is a doctoral student in my lab, and Sanjay Srivastava, who's another faculty member. And we looked in particular at three strategies that psychologists have pointed to as like effective tools for self-control. I won't go into detail yet about what they are, but just for now, suffice to say, one of them is called implementation intentions, which are just sort of short if-then plans for what to do if you encounter a temptation. One of them is called mental contrasting, which is really kind of, you could think of it as like mental flexibility, right? And like when you're faced with a problem, how many different ways can you approach that problem? That's kind of an example of that. And then temporal orientation is how well do you shift between thinking about the present versus the future. So again, we'll come back to those, but the point is we looked at these three strategies that psychologists have looked at, and we asked this question, do people differ from one another in their tendency to use these? And if so, is that predictive of how good they are at self-control? So here's my collaborators on the project. So you know them if you ever see them out in the world, and say hi. So planfulness, we developed a 30-item scale, a questionnaire measure that kind of maps onto those different constructs. And so here you can see some examples of the kinds of questions that we ask people, when planning ahead. I've tried to learn from mistakes that I made in the past, right? So that's an example of thinking and making connections between, past and present. I often come up with unworkable plans, right? So that's, we would call that reverse keyed. So higher scores on that item mean lower planfulness, right? I prefer to take things as they come rather than set out with a specific plan of action. And people would answer on a, let's say a 1 to 5 scale on, I never do this to I do this all the time. And it turns out this 30-item scale had a lot of really nice properties. We were able to measure self-control. It was stable over time. It correlated with the kinds of things we would expect it to correlate with. And importantly, a big question for us was, does it actually predict people's behavior going forward, right? So if I measure somebody's level of planfulness using our scale, can I then predict what's going to happen in the future? We ran this study here at U of O in collaboration with the Rec Center. And what we did was at the beginning of the academic year, we measured people's planfulness using our scale. And we found undergraduates who had some kind of physical activity goal, right? So students who said, oh, I want to go to the gym, at least twice a week for the whole term. That would be an example. Then we tracked their gym attendance, at least in terms of how often they swiped into the UO Rec Center here. So we had about 280 participants in our study. They were all underducts. We had about 18,000 gym visits that we tracked across about 2.5 terms. And what we did was we looked and said, okay, if I know your level of planfulness, how well can I predict how often you swipe into the gym and how much of essentially what percentage of your goal, right? So if somebody said, I want to attend twice a week for 10 weeks, but they only attended, say, 15 times out of 20, right? So that we'd give them a score of about 75%, right? And what we found indeed is that there was a meaningful correlation there. It wasn't 100%, as you can see, but the higher people's planfulness score was, the more successful they were in their goal. And just to put it like on the 1 to 5 scale of planfulness, a 1 point increase in planfulness predicted about 13 and a half extra gym visits across the term. So fairly meaningful. So the bottom line, and I should just highlight, that's just one, tiny little example of the kinds of research that people do in this space of like trying to understand what are the different pieces, what are different ways to be good at self-control, how do you measure that, do those measures have any validity in the world? Bottom line, at least for this little segment, is just to say that planfulness, planning, and forethought can be a predictor of goal progress. And to us, one of the things that says is that self-control, in part, again, we're not claiming this is everything, but at least a big part of it is the ability to kind of pause, reflect, and be flexible and strategic in your thinking about goals. There's a lot to kind of follow up on here. One of the things that we've followed up on is, can it be taught, right? Planfulness, we've thought about this as a kind of capacity or a tendency, that some people are better or worse at this, but these are things that you can learn to do. To what extent is it genetic or environmental? We don't have answers to those questions. They're good questions, and other people have studied related things that we can get into maybe in the Q&A. And then how does it vary with neurodiversity, right? You might have noticed that a lot of planning is a challenge for example, people with ADHD, right? There's different kind of barriers that every individual faces, and certain neurocognitive disorders such as ADHD can make it a little bit difficult to set goals for some of these reasons. But of course, there's always, multiple sides to that coin. There's certain kind of features of people with ADHD that can actually make them a particularly good at goals in the right conditions. So we can come back to that. Given time constraints, I want to turn to our next big question, which is, why does self-control fail? That's a big one. For many, many years, you might have heard about this concept of what's called ego depletion, or this idea that when you exert self-control, it's kind of a limited resource in the sense that, like almost like a gas tank, right? That using self-control, resisting temptations, right? Inhibiting, preventing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are counter to your goals, you're kind of burning that energy, or you're kind of expending some sort of limited resource. And when it's gone, then your self-control fails. And the way that scientists have studied that, the so-called limited resource theory, is by kind of manipulating self-control and having people exert self-control in some domain. So let's say affective, meaning emotion. So you'd come into the lab, you would try to regulate your emotions in response to some very sad or disgusting or otherwise upsetting stimulus or video, something like that. And you're told, try to inhibit your emotions as much as possible. Do that for a while. And then you go into a different domain of self-control, like behavioral or cognitive, right? A cognitive example would be like, try to think of a whole bunch of words that don't have the letter I in them, or something like that, where as soon as you start to think that, it actually becomes even harder to think of words that don't have the letter I in them. And they show that compared to people who didn't engage in self-control before, right, who did some other task that wasn't, that didn't rely on self-control, the people who had to do kind of the second task don't perform as well, right? That's the basic idea of ego depletion. And it's very kind of relatable, right? I feel like ego depletion is an intuitive thing. It's like, basically you get tired, right? You're doing a hard task, and after a while you get tired. And then if you're asked to do a second hard task, you don't perform as well. So this is, and for actually a long time, it's kind of hard to understate how much this really dominated the field of self-control, this phenomenon called the limited resource theory, or ego depletion, right? The literally, like, your ego is depleted. But people tried to understand what is it? Like, what is that actual limited resource that runs out? At some point, somebody had this idea that it was actually glucose. It was like the energy in, in your blood that powers your cells, presumably your neurons, right, kind of runs out. Well, that turns out not to be the case, right? Doing hard mental processes doesn't actually affect your blood glucose in any meaningful way. Yes, our brains do use a lot of energy throughout the course of a day, but engaging in some effortful task doesn't actually deplete your energy in the same way that, using your like muscle tissue, right, going to the gym or something really does, even though it feels like it might. Local energy, meaning like the amount of energy your brain actually consumes in a particular spot, right, that would be engaged in one of these tasks is less than 1%. So it's just a tiny amount of fuel that would never really deplete the energy in your blood. And here's just one kind of data point, right, that these researchers doing some kind of physiological study said, even if there was a 10% increase in activity in your entire brain, which would be a lot. Usually a task doesn't use your whole brain, right? It's just sort of selective parts of it. But even if you engaged activity across your whole brain for 5 minutes, that would be an additional zero point 0.2 calories. And the kind of drinks that they would give people contain many, many more calories than that. So it's not glucose. So what could it be? Well, here's another data point that kind of helped researchers think about what is it when you're engaging self-control for a long time, why does it feel like you get tired, right? I've already told you it's not because your brain runs out of energy. This study and many that kind of followed from this, this is from Veronica Yob and Carol Dweck, who you might recognize the name Dweck. She is the person at Stanford who's famous for this idea of mindsets, right? Like a growth mindset, right? It's pretty famous in the education space, this idea that like the way you approach a task, right? Are you trying to get everything right? Or are you trying to that's called a fixed mindset, right? Where like I'm taking a test and however I do just tells me how good I am at the thing. That would be like a fixed mindset. Whereas I take the test and the idea is, well, no, this test is just helping me kind of develop, and the score that I get is reflective of where I am right now. But in doing the test, I might actually get better. All right, that's what Carol would call a growth mindset. So she applied the same kind of thing to ego depletion and said, well, what if people actually just have lay beliefs, or they have sort of intuitions about tasks like this? And so what she did was she asked people about their beliefs about self-control. It's kind of meta, right? It was sort of like, well, if you do self-control, do you get tired? Some people in these black bars, she called limited resource theory. So that means like people who believed that willpower or ego or self-control was a limited resource. So for them, when they did that ego depletion task that I described, where you do one hard thing and then another hard thing, right? They showed that same pattern, right? So they had an increase in mistakes when they went through the depleting condition compared to when they didn't, right? So those are those two black bars that you're looking at. In contrast, some people didn't actually hold that belief, right? When Carol and her colleagues asked, when you engage in self-control, does it deplete, or is it a kind of renewable resource, right? Those are the white bars. So people who believed in a renewable resource didn't show that pattern at all. And actually, if anything, they made fewer mistakes on the second task, right after they did a depleting thing compared to when they didn't. So those people kind of showed like a growth mindset, if you will, in the sense that on the second task, after they'd already failed a little bit, they kind of got a little bit better. So this really undermined this idea that self-control is a limited resource at all. And it kind of made psychologists go back to the drawing board and say, wait a second, if it's not a physiological resource like a muscle would be, right, where your muscles actually get tired because of kind of physiological processes, what's going on here? So there was a number of studies after that one that came along and said, oh, well, it actually turns out, you don't show as much ego depletion or that kind of same depletion pattern when you feel a sense of autonomy. So when you give people the chance to choose the tasks they're doing and feel like they have some control over the tasks they're doing, those kinds of, in that situation, people don't show self-control failure as much either. You can motivate people with incentives, right? So you get tired, sure. But all of a sudden we said, okay, well, would you do this for $10? All right, all of a sudden performance gets better, right? And to me, that's a good example. Like my colleagues, one of my colleagues in the field always says the example of like, yeah, you feel like you're tired at the end of a day. And we all can relate to that, right? You come home after work, you're exhausted, you feel depleted. But then, like, maybe a friend texts or something and is like, oh, hey, do you want to meet up at that new restaurant or something that is really exciting to you, right? All of a sudden, right, you get your energy back. It's not that you're actually physically out of energy. It's more that you're just kind of mentally tired. But that mental fatigue can be replenished much more easily than a physical resource. Even just shifting to a new task domain, right? So doing two tasks in a row, maybe it's just that it's kind of boring, and that our attention wanes over time, and that when you're doing something a little bit new, when you introduce some variety, that in and of its is a kind of reward in and of itself, and can also prevent the self-control failure that happens on a repeated task. And then some scientists have also studied this idea of opportunity costs, which is an economic idea, but the basic idea is, well, maybe what happens when you're doing self-control is that over time, you realize that the longer you're doing something, the more that you're giving up doing something else, right? So if I'm, working for an hour, that means it was an hour I spent not doing all the other things that I have to do. That's the idea of an opportunity cost in terms of time. And so Bob Kurtzman and his colleagues showed that when people essentially didn't have other things that they needed to do, or if the task they were working on was their top priority, like it was the best thing they could be working on at the time, then people also didn't show that depletion. So in their view, self-control failure happens. It's kind of a signal to us basically to say, hey, whatever you're doing, it's using too much of your attention and uh, it's occupying too much mental space because there's other things that you need to turn to. And so it's a kind of, a nudge, a way that our minds help us kind of turn the page when we need to. So the bottom line on this little bit, I'll just say, is depletion is not a fixed physical resource, right? Even when you might feel tired, mentally tired, I mean, it's not because you're out of energy, glucose, oxygen, anything like that. It's really about how you perceive the task and the alternatives, right? What else you might be doing with your time and your energy. So there's a lot of implications here. I'll just walk through a couple that kind of strike me, and that researchers have studied. One of them is burnout, right? So one way to view burnout is a kind of like long-term form of ego depletion where, again, it feels like being tired, but it might not actually be a physical or physiological fatigue. It might be a fatigue with whatever, it's a signal to you that says, look, whatever you're doing is probably not the best use of your time, and there might be something else, right? You could think of burnout as a form of misalignment between whatever your current task is and what your real priorities are. In kids, one of the implications here is that kids care about different things than adults do, right? So often when we see things that kids or especially adolescents do to adults, it looks like self-control failure. Through this lens, one of the interpretations of the data that I presented is, well, maybe for a kid, the thing they're doing is just not as high priority for them, right? As we think it should be for them as our adult. Like, why aren't you studying? I say to my eighth grader, well, it's not very high priority for him. And so he's going to kind of get, depleted doing studying compared to other things. I'll come back to ADHD, right? Again, we've talked about the centrality of attention and kind of how attention can wax and wane, and that has influence on task performance. Well, ADHD is in part a disorder of attention and attention regulation. All right, before I turn the page to our next segment here, I just want to take a quick look at the Q&A and see if there's anything that, oh yeah, sorry, I had a good question there. Let's see. Let me talk about, let's see. Okay, so somebody asked a question about MCII. I apologize. I used that acronym on one of the slides. MCII is, it stands for mental contrasting with implementation intentions. So I know that's a lot of jargon. I've been using the term implementation intentions. Those are the simple if-then plans. MCII is kind of a fancy version of that, and I'll turn to that in the last segment. Let's see. John asks, can reflection and pausing be planned? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, this is a really good strategy to help mitigate ego depletion, or let's call it self-control fatigue, right? Which is that taking a break is a good thing. One of the reasons is because it is it's a change, essentially. Like one of the things that our attention system seems to respond to is shifting gears, right? If you've been attending to one thing for a long time, your attention will start to wane kind of normally. Maybe it's a reflection of opportunity costs. We still don't know exactly why, but taking a pause to reflect, essentially just do something different, almost anything different, right? To give your kind of mental system a chance to focus on something else, maybe satisfy some of those other needs that you have, right? And then come back is a good thing. And it can absolutely be planned. There are really good software tools out there. That maybe you're aware of some of them, or you can recommend some in the chat, right? That actually will do this for you, right? You can set up your day and divide it up into little blocks, right? 30 minutes of work, 10 minutes off, 30 minutes of work, whatever. And then when you're in the work period, some of those software packages have a feature where it'll basically shut you out of, your web browser, out of your email, out of your text messages, so that you can really focus on whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing for that period of time. And then you know that you have a break coming up. And so it makes it a little bit easier to kind of get through those periods of intense focus. That's something I've seen a lot. I think we would call that a situational and other deployed or other deployed tool, because it essentially is saying like, look, I know I'm going to struggle with this, so I'm going to set up my environment, right, the situation, in a way that helps me achieve this goal. Let's see here. So John asks also, like, wouldn't glucose deficiency as a pre-existing condition contribute to more likely breakdown in self-control? That's a complicated question. I'll say not purely for actual glucose deficiency. The way it turns out, the way our bodies are wired is that and this actually makes a good amount of evolutionary sense. Our bodies will starve every other organ of glucose before the brain, right? And so your brain is kind of the last organ to go. And so to be glucose deficient to the point that that your brain actually doesn't have enough glucose to function, all of your other organs would already be in failure, right? And so like that level of glucose depletion, yes. I mean, I guess, yes, technically, like that's basically, you die. But in terms of like just, low body glucose, low blood sugar as a kind of everyday condition, not the fatal kind, but the kind where you're low blood sugar, that's definitely not in the territory where your brain doesn't actually have enough energy. That has other things, right? So having a physical illness or physical conditions, pain, right? Those are extremely distracting and make self-control quite difficult, but not for physiological reasons, but more for like attentional reasons, right? Pain is a signal to your body, to your mind, essentially, that like something is happening that you need to attend to, right? Which makes it really hard to focus on other things. That's the purpose of pain. Yes, let's see here. Changing self-image. Good. Sam asked about changing self-image. Let me turn to that because I do research in that space, and I'll talk about it a little bit here. And we have time, so let's continue. Okay, let's talk about everyday self-control. So right off the bat, what I'll say is, this was kind of for a long time in the field, there was this hypothesis that self-control is a little bit like, again, kind of like depletion. It's like a muscle where, well, if it's like a muscle, it depletes, yes, but if you train it, right, like weightlifting for your brain, if you will, you should get better. And that's kind of an intuitive idea. It was something that there was some initial evidence. This isn't even that old, right, as far as research goes, say 15 years ago. There was a lot of studies like this where we have people practicing self-control, literally practicing like these kinds of tasks that I tell you about, where you're sitting at a computer and you're told to focus in a certain way, or to avoid doing something, right? Like avoid moving your eyes to the left, for 15 minutes or something. It's harder than you'd think. And that would be a form of practice. And there was some initial evidence that as people practice self-control, they got better at it and they were better at other things like quitting smoking. Here is what this graph is showing. Turns out, kind of upon reinspection or further analysis, there were a lot of studies like this, and psychologists did what we called meta-analyses, right? So you're doing like a study of studies. And it turns out this kind of practice in terms of self-control, working memory, other mental functions really doesn't work. What I mean by doesn't work, it doesn't generate improvements in other domains. So yes, you can get good at a specific task by practicing it a lot. That's very intuitive, but that doesn't transfer. So just because I'm good at like this one particular working memory quiz, that doesn't make my memory better in general. And even the improvements on the one quiz that people would practice, that doesn't last, right? So if I go back, bring them back into the lab 6 months later, they're no different than people that didn't do any training at all, right? So this kind of raw, like practice it and try to strengthen it like a muscle kind of training does not seem to work. What does work? Well, let me just walk you through a little bit of 4 different examples of the kinds of behaviors that people are interested in. These were some questions that you all asked, so I'm trying to be responsive to that. And to kind of map and just show you examples of the kinds of studies that people have done, and to give you a flavor of the various tools and strategies that we've studied and that can be effective. Okay, so just a reminder, these are that kind of map of the space. This isn't the definitive map. This is just one way of kind of parsing out this space, right? Thinking about for tools, is it cognitive, meaning like, is it between your ears, right? Versus situational, meaning, is this something that I build in the environment, right? And then is it self-deployed versus other deployed? There's lots of ways to think about this space, but this is kind of a handy way of thinking about some of these. So let's talk about screen time. So classic one, strategy here, the broad strategy would be what economists or behavioral economists would call choice architecture, meaning, and this is a very situational strategy, right? It's sort of like literally build your environment, or deliver, give yourself a set of choices that prevents you from engaging in the thing that you're trying not to do, right? And so a specific tool is called choosing in advance or pre-planning or pre-committing. So these all are referring to the same thing, but it's essentially this idea of like, before you even are faced with a choice, you restrict the options that you give yourself, right? So one good example of this from this is about health. This is kind of in the healthy eating domain. These folks were trying to eat more healthfully, and the manipulation here was people chose in advance what kinds of food they would purchase, right? So rather than I can't remember the exact setup, but it was something like you basically pre-commit to purchase a certain amount of healthy food, and then you don't even have the option of getting the unhealthy food, right? Like they somehow set it up so that you do this. And it turns out, right, when you pre-commit, choose in advance to buy healthier things, people do tend to spend more of their money on healthy food. Another example of this that's quite effective is in screen time, online gaming, online gambling. There's been a number of studies in this space, so just one that I'll highlight for you. So here was a study that people did in collaboration with one of those like online sports betting apps, where they gave people the option to set a limit on the amount and the frequency of their gambling. This is actually a fairly common feature on these apps, I understand. And so what we're looking at here is we're comparing the orange to the blue, right, in these 2 different conditions, right? And so when people had the option of setting a limit compared to before they had the option, that's the orange, post message, that's the blue, right? They bet a lot less, yes, a lot less frequently, right? It went down. So you can see these are kind of the means here. So on average, before the message, people were betting around 25% of the time. And then when after they they had that option of pre-committing, basically, right, forcing themselves to bet less, that went down by about 10%. So, sorry, I know this is a little bit complicated graph to interpret. I thought it looked cool, but all it's saying is compared to before the message, right, when you have the option of pre-committing, that does have a real effect on people's, in this case, on their gambling behavior. But this has been shown in online gaming and also in screen time in general. Those are choice architecture. There's another strategy. So let's talk about life transitions or big kind of big life goals. And I'll bundle this into a type of strategy called identity, or how you think about yourself, right? So this is now a self-imposed, more cognitive strategy, sort of to this question from Sam about how do how people changing their self-image. The specific tool here, let's call it be versus do, right? Is this something, meaning do would be, I want to quit smoking, right? So there it's a verb. I want to quit smoking, right? A be goal would be, I want to be a quitter, right? I'm identifying as a quitter. So it's not a verb, it's a noun. Like that's part of who I am, the quitter. So that's an example of an identity manipulation. And here's just, again, one study. This is from the domain of smoking cessation. So these are folks who are trying to quit smoking. And again, the manipulation here was people either had this low non-smoker self-identity. So that was more like, I don't think of myself as a non-smoker. I just want to quit smoking. Whereas people on the right side here had a higher non-smoker identity, meaning I want to think about myself as a quitter. I want to become a quitter, not necessarily quit smoking, right? So that's this kind of noun versus verb. Of course, what you see is the more kind of be identity, the more you thought of yourself as a quitter, the more likely you were to quit. And that was true for both people who were high and low in socioeconomic status. It was particularly true for people that were lower in socioeconomic status. That's probably because people low in SES tend to smoke at higher rates, and so kind of have more room to grow. One example from the health domain is what's called environmental design, or again, kind of creating your environment to promote healthy behaviors. And this is a tool that Angela Duckworth calls habit scaffolds. So it relies on the science of habits and kind of focuses on this question of, well, how can we use the science of habits to make our habits, to improve habits, right? And the way this really works is, again, modify your environment, and specifically to make the behavior that you're trying to do more likely. So literally, like if I want to run more often, I'll put my running shoes out, right? And like literally I have to like walk over them if I want to get, in my door, something like that, right? You want to reward the target behavior. So anytime you do the behavior, give yourself some kind of little reward. And then use tech as much as possible to remind you and uh, in the right kind of moments and contexts to give you reminders to do those things. And so here's a couple of examples from Wood and Neal, right? They have done quite a bit of studies in this habit space, trying to get people to form habits and habits that stick. And so you can see on the x-axis here, I'm showing you at both 3 and 6 months. So this is quite a bit of time, right? Half a year. And in these habit change programs that they did, and this top one was showing weight loss and how many pounds people lost. This one down here is showing healthy eating using an electronic monitoring program where literally there was like a reminder on their phone when the phone detected that people were eating at a faster pace than they wanted to. That kind of buzzed them and reminded them like, oh yeah, don't, slow down, chew a certain number of times and, take your time eating. That's one way to actually eat less. So this is just one kind of very quick overview of a really broad, just the tip of an iceberg, really, of many, many, many studies where people tried to help folks build healthy habits and some of the tools and tricks that they would use to do that. All right, one last quick example before I conclude. Let's talk about emotion regulation, right? And so literally what I'm talking about is controlling or managing your emotions when in moments when you feel like you don't want to have such intense emotions. So a common example would be like a difficult interaction at work, right? Where you feel yourself becoming angry and you realize that's not, appropriate or helpful in this particular situation, right? Or feelings of sadness or fear, right? There's many examples where we have those emotions, we probably want to have them a little bit less. And so here's an example of using implementation intentions, which I've mentioned before. They're these simple if-then plans. The idea with implementation intentions is that sometimes it's hard to deal with things in the moment. There's a lot going on, right? You have to be really quick sometimes, especially when it comes to emotion, right? You have an emotional response very fast, right? It feels like it kind of erupts out of you. So implementation intentions solve that problem by saying, hey, let's anticipate that might happen and come up with a plan, right? So if I find myself getting angry, right, in this situation that I'm walking into, what am I going to do, right? If I feel like I'm going to get angry, the first thing I'm going to do is focus on my breath, right? Slowly inhale for 5 seconds, allow myself to think for a little bit before I say anything, right? So that would be just a simple, that's an implementation intention right there, right? If I feel myself getting angry, then I'm going to do this. And an important part of that is planning ahead, right? Just so you kind of have it at the ready. So when that moment comes, you know exactly what to do. The person who studied this most is named Peter Gollwitzer, and he calls them instant habits, which is just a handy way of thinking about implementation intentions. Earlier, I used the acronym MCII. So you can pair implementation intentions with this other tool called mental contrasting, which is kind of thinking through different obstacles that you might encounter along the way. And that just makes it even more powerful, right? You can think of mental contrasting and implementation intentions as kind of companion things to think about a situation. So come up with that if-then plan, but also think about, well, what might happen, right? Like what might prevent me from doing that, right? Like let's say I feel myself getting angry, but I don't have time to take a deep breath because the other person is, spouting out so many things that I feel like I need to respond right away, right? So that's just essentially a little bit more elaborate way of making a plan. But if people did that, to the extent people do that, it turns out that they become better at regulating their emotions. So what I'm showing you here is just this bar on the left where people created implementation intentions about how they were going to regulate their emotions. Higher numbers mean essentially more successful emotion regulation. And they were more successful even compared to people who beforehand came up with the intention to regulate their emotion. So essentially had a goal, but didn't do any advanced planning, right? And that's this goal attention condition. And that even extended to the level of the brain. A lot of people have done neuroimaging studies on this, showing like, yes, indeed, you create an implementation intention, and then you can see what happens in people's brain as they execute that plan. And it turns out, yes, you're more likely to recruit these regions of the prefrontal cortex that are associated with effective emotion regulation. All right, so that was a lot. I know I'm just giving you like a tiny little sampling of the kinds of things that psychologists have done. What I'll say is the bottom line is that self-control is difficult to train in the way that you train a muscle, but simple tools, mental reframes, and environmental design can be effective. Psychologists have identified dozens of such tools. I showed you that slide with the X and Y axis from Angela Duckworth, right? We've identified a lot of these things. They don't work, none of them work for everyone, but most of them will work for some people, right? So a lot of this is a kind of matching, play around, try to find a set of tools that works for you. I'll try to provide some resources afterwards where, I'll at least share that Duckworth paper, which kind of goes and uses everyday language to describe all these different things and present some evidence about each one. So recapping, what did we learn? Self-control is not one thing, right? It can be achieved in many ways, right? Self-control is really, fundamentally, it's about an outcome. It's about being successful in somehow avoiding, managing, inhibiting impulses that run counter to your goal. How you do that? There's many ways. Why does it fail? Well, it's not that self-control or willpower is a limited resource. Really, it fails because our intention and motivation waxes and wanes over time. One reason is because we kind of have this internal system that manages our time and says, hey, there's other stuff that that would be a better use of your time, right? That's an opportunity cost signal. Sometimes it's effort, fatigue, or other forms of attention. But it comes and goes, and there are tricks that you can use to kind of restore your attention, incentives, giving yourself a break, feeling like you have a sense of autonomy. Um, and these simple tools can help, right? We don't have a panacea. Humans are complicated. Self-control is complicated, right? I started by telling you that we're famously bad at this thing that is supposedly a unique skill for humans. And yet there are tools that can kind of give us a little bit of benefit here and there. All right, with that, I'll stop. Let's turn to the Q&A. And I want to first just highlight this is my lab group here at the University of Oregon. We're gathered in this picture in the Lewis Integrative Neurosciences building, or Liz. Sorry, Lewis Integrative Sciences building on campus. And I want to recognize our funders who have supported the work in the lab. So thank you all. And I think for Q&A, I'll probably stop sharing and turn it over for moderation.
Well, so thank you so much. This was great. And I'm going to just jump right into some questions since we just have a couple minutes left. But there's one question that was submitted, and it also relates to some of the questions that were submitted in advance. But it's how long does it take to change a habit? And then I'm also curious, we had some questions about long-term versus short-term changes and what the difference is there.
It's a good question. It's a great question. I mean, there's no, you may have heard about this 10,000 hours thing, right? Or no, 10,000 hours makes you an expert. But anyway, there's some apocryphal number. The reason I don't remember it is because it's not true, right? Like some habits you can change in a weekend, some habits take a decade, right? There's no like secret formula. The recipe for habit formation is three things, right? Engage in the behavior, reward the behavior, and then pair it with some kind of cue, right? This is really, really basic, like associative learning, associative conditioning, essentially, right? Think of the thing you want to do, same as you train your dog, right? Basically, like the same principles work on humans. They don't seem to work on cats, but they work on dogs, they work on humans, right? So do the thing, reward it, and then pair it with some cue, right? That reminds you to do that. And over time, the cue, essentially feels like it's a conditioned stimulus, right? It gets associated with the behavior even without the reward. So that's why this old advice of like baby steps, do small steps towards your goal and reward them. That's good advice, right? That's grounded in solid evidence about reward learning and habit learning. The other thing about habits is when it comes to breaking them, it's really hard to just straight up like stop doing a habit. It's much easier to start doing a new habit, right? That's kind of the way our habit system works, is it doesn't exactly have a vocabulary for like stopping something. We would call that extinction in the learning literature, but it's much easier to learn a new habit. So think about like a counter habit that would, be sort of a different behavior from the thing that you've been doing, and focus on that. And how long do they last? Well, I showed you some examples from that Wendy Wood and Neal paper where they did like the habit scaffolding. And I mean, it can last, they showed up to 6 months. They can last a long time. Habits are a little bit like, uh, we use the term rut, right? But think about literally like it's a good metaphor, right? Because a rut is like a track, right, that runs water or something that will flow through it, right? Once you create a new track, a new rut, right, then it can persist, right, as long as you keep kind of engaging in that behavior every once in a while.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all your expertise with us on this. I think there's a lot for us to think about in here. Um, and I'm going to wrap things up and just want to remind all of the participants here, we did record this webinar and we will send it out to everybody afterwards. So make sure to check your email for that. But Elliot, thank you so much again for joining us this afternoon. And I also just want to it's really fascinating research, and I'm so happy that we're able to share it with all of our alumni. Um,
Well, thanks
and
for having me.
yeah, of course. And again, thank you to everybody who joined us today. We'll email a copy of this lecture in the next couple days. I do ask that you please take a moment just to scan the QR code on the screen or click the link that's in the chat and just use them to help we use a lot of this feedback from these surveys to help us select different topics for future webinars. I read all of the responses, so thank you in advance for submitting your feedback. I'd also like to invite all of you just to save the date for our next online faculty session. So if you liked this, in October, we're going to be hosting a webinar called Killer Curiosity, the Allure of True Crime with Whitney Phillips, who's an assistant professor of information politics and ethics with the School of Journalism and Communication. And that's going to be on Friday, October 3rd. And so you can all expect an email with more information on that in the coming weeks. But thank you so much once again for tuning in. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and be on the lookout for the email follow-up with the recording. So thank you all. Go Ducks!